Good evening. And tonight the story rests in ancient Latium, c. 771 BCE, in Alba Longa on the western slopes of the Alban Hills, above a still blue crater lake, where the ruling house said it began with a boy carried out of fallen Troy. Pranali from Mumbai and Hannah from Yorkshire both commented on the last video and stayed until the end, and it is very nice to have them here again. Where are you, and what time is it for you tonight? Share it in the comments like Pranali and Hannah, and like and subscribe so each calm visit to the past is easy to find when sleep is near. Have you ever noticed how one worried person can make an entire household walk a little more softly? So the sandals are dusted, the tablets are unwrapped, and Alba Longa begins to gather around the page. Laurel smoke drifts over warm stone, burnt grain sweetens the air, and the far Tiber lies on the plain like a thin strip of polished silver. In the record room, the new chronicler is setting out his ink, while Amulius, a man who read one prophecy and never emotionally recovered, sweats beneath a crooked gold wreath. A Vestal keeps her secret, and downriver 2 infants move gently toward history. In the record room above Alba Longa's steep street, the wax still smells faintly of smoke and honey. You warm one tablet near the lamp, and an old division of power comes clear. The first account is neat, in the way troubling things often are. Numitor received the kingship, Amulius received the treasury. A scribe pressed each word with patient care, as if tidy lettering could prevent family trouble. The tablet is small enough to fit in 2 hands, its edges are thumb-smooth from checking and rechecking. Someone once tied it with red wool, and a thread still clings to one corner. Outside, the hill city wakes slowly above the blue crater lake. Laurel smoke drifts from morning hearths. The far Tiber lies on the plain like a bright strip of tin. The division must have sounded sensible at first. One brother would wear the wreath and hear petitions, the other would count silver cups and bronze bars, and no one would have to share a key. Official records love this kind of arrangement. They make family life sound like a shelf of labeled jars, grain in one jar, oil in another, human envy in none at all. The old clerks noted practical matters with touching confidence. Numitor kept the palace rooms facing east. Amulius took the lower storehouses near the gate. The seal chest went with the crown. The treasury lists are longer than the royal lists. There are cups from Ardea. There are brooches with amber beads. There are mules, 4 yoke chains, and 12 cloaks with purple borders. A kingdom is harder to count than a room full of bowls. A king holds loyalties, memories, and who sits where at dinner. A treasury holds the dinner plates themselves, which is not nothing. In later years, this split would look less like balance and more like a very early accounting error. Alba Longa was already behaving like the original Rome-adjacent startup. Its founding headquarters had made a serious internal spreadsheet choice. Numitor appears in the first years as calm and ceremonious. His name sits beside offerings, boundary judgments, and spring rites. He is always present where things are made official and gently dull. Amulius appears in other columns. He pays smiths, he pays drovers, he pays men who repair harness straps and spear shafts. Money has a way of leaving footprints in dry dust. You can almost hear the city through these little marks. Sandals slap on stone, donkeys complain by the lower court. Somewhere, a cook scrapes yesterday's porridge from a pot with an olive wood spoon. At first, the brothers seem to move in parallel. Numitor presides, Amulius provides. One has the chair. The other quietly buys cushions for everyone sitting near it. The witnesses, much later, would never say the change happened in one clean moment. They would rub their wrists and speak of small shifts. A door guard replaced here, a steward promoted there. Amulius was patient in the useful, chilly way of a man counting sacks in winter. He did not grab at the crown on the first afternoon. He let wealth do its slow work. In the market accounts, familiar names begin to gather around him. A brewer receives favorable grain terms. A horse trader wins a dispute. A cousin's son suddenly finds regular work escorting carts. Silver turns into friendship with remarkable ease. Bronze turns into armed friendship even faster. A full purse can sound very noble when it clears its throat at the right meeting. The king's household still used old cups with worn rims. Amulius ordered new ones with cleaner lines and brighter polish. People notice who serves the better wine, even before they notice anything important. You can picture those evenings without strain. Lamps hiss softly in shallow dishes. Bread rounds cool on woven trays. Men lean close over figs, onions, and bits of salted cheese, and call it counsel. Amulius listened more than he spoke. This gave him the air of depth, though it may also have been caution. A silent man with money can seem wise before he has said anything. He kept scribes near him at all hours. Their fingers were always dark with ink and smoke. Wax tablets stacked beside his couch like little sleeping turtles. Years pass in records by the simple trick of changing dates. In life, they pass by worn sandals and growing boys. Amulius used both methods and kept excellent time. Numitor still performed the rites on the hill. He still poured wine on the altar stone. Yet the men carrying benches, water jars, and sacrificial grain were often paid from his brother's purse. A king can survive many insults. What he cannot easily survive is becoming expensive to support. Nothing cools devotion like delayed wages and a kitchen that has gone short on oil. By then, Amulius had acquired the settled look of a man who read one prophecy and never emotionally recovered. Even before the prophecy mattered, he practiced worrying in advance. It saved time later. His gold laurel wreath appears in one witness note as slightly crooked during a public feast. This feels so true that it almost serves as legal proof. Some details carry their own stamp. The palace guards changed slowly enough that no one could point to a single purge. An old man retired, a younger one married well, another was assigned to storehouses and somehow never returned to the upper court. The new guards were not grand soldiers, they were practical men with thick wrists and sandals resoled twice. They knew which doors stuck in damp weather and which stair creaked before dawn. You smell the leather oil on their belts, just reading the inventory. You hear spear butts knock stone in the passage. These are tiny sounds, but governments are built from tiny sounds. Amulius learned who needed dowries and who needed debt relief. He learned whose field had poor drainage. He learned which uncle drank too much and could be persuaded by a well-timed loan. This is how a throne is often approached, not with a trumpet, with a ledger, a basket of gifts, and a memorized list of everyone's practical inconvenience. The city itself remained handsome through all of this. Alba Longa sat bright on its slope above the still lake. Warm stone held the sun. Vines climbed walls with total confidence in tomorrow. Yet in the corridors, people began to lower their voices around Numitor's name, not out of hatred. More from the mild caution used near a cracked jar that has not fallen yet. A farmhand later recalled seeing two sets of liveried servants at the lower gate. One carried the king's seal chest, the other carried Amulius's sealed money bags. Guess which group was followed more closely. Officially, no one had overturned anything. Unofficially, ancient Latium's first hostile corporate takeover was well underway. The founding family was being removed from the board by men with very dusty sandals. When later records finally present Amulius as king, they do so with suspicious neatness. There is no dramatic scene, there is only a new dating formula and a very brisk change in honorifics. That is often how courtiers survive. They trim the wording, they dry the ink. They do not ask the scroll to explain what everyone's face already knew. The whispered testimony tells the slower truth. By then, Numitor's sons had become inconvenient facts walking around in wool cloaks. Their existence made the line of succession untidy, which tyrants find exhausting. The first son vanishes into a hunting account. The note is almost insulting in its plainness. Dogs were loosed at dawn. Horses were saddled before sunrise. The party did not fully return. Hunting lists are wonderfully domestic things until they are not. They mention spare straps, lunch bread, and a flask of watered wine. They mention 2 nets repaired the day before. One stable boy remembered oiling a chestnut horse for that trip. He rubbed the animal down with coarse wool. He tucked dried thyme under the saddlecloth because flies were bad that week. Another servant remembered packing a small bundle for the prince. It held a knife, a fresh tunic, and 3 round cakes sweetened with crushed dates. A mother had added the cakes. No witness saw anything clear enough to preserve. The hills swallow sound and men become careful afterward. Still, the prince did not return to his peg in the sleeping room. His cloak stayed absent from the rack. His cup stayed upside down on a shelf. For several days, one young servant kept bringing out an extra stool by habit. The second son lasted longer in the records, which somehow feels worse, and also more ordinary. There are mentions of him hearing a boundary case. There is a note about new sandals issued for travel. Then comes the phrase that tells its own quiet story. He was sent away for the good of the city. Such wording is smooth as lamp oil, and just as slippery. Exile in these records means a mule, a wrapped cloak, and enough bread for the road. It means a gate watched by men who look carefully at your hands. It means no promise of return. You can picture the packing more easily than the decree. A servant folds wool against the evening chill. Someone tucks in garlic, salt, and a needle case. The future leaves in a small bag. Later gossip disagreed on the destination, which is often how false certainty sounds. Some said the coast. Some said the Sabine Hills. Everyone agreed the road lengthened once he was on it. Numitor's house lost young voices one by one. The rooms would have gone oddly hollow in the afternoon. Even a quiet family sounds different when the next generation has been cleared like brush. No public lament survives. Courts dislike grief that suggests bookkeeping errors at the top. A missing prince is easier to manage when everyone suddenly develops respect for silence. Amulius did not need to remove every cousin in a single sweep. He worked like a careful cleaner in a grain store. First one mouse hole, then another, then the last bit of chewable rope. By the time the city adjusted its daily rhythm, Numitor had no sons near him. He still had his name, he still had his posture. In politics, posture is useful, though it cannot open gates. He was permitted to live, which the records present as generosity. Generosity is such a flexible word. It can cover a loaf, a field, or the decision not to make things even more awkward. The estate given to him lay outside the city walls. It sat where the slope gentled toward orchards and rough pasture. From there, the roofs of Alba Longa looked close enough to touch and far enough to sting. You reach those details through rent notes and mule paths. 2 fig trees marked the well. The goat shed needed patching every winter. A windbreak of woven reeds faced the colder side. Numitor's new life is easier to see than his old court, because farms leave honest traces. There are lists of lentils. There are records for pruning hooks. There is a bill for repairing a cracked water jar. He rose with the plain light over the Alban hills. He drank watered milk or small beer, depending on the season. He ate bread that was denser than palace bread and probably better. A former maid remembered him mending a vine tie with his own hands. This impressed her greatly. Kings are expected to hold cups, not cords, though both jobs require a certain steady grip. He wore simpler wool now. The cloth was thick and serviceable. It smelled of sun, lanolin, and the cedar chest where winter garments waited their turn. At midday, the estate kitchen simmered the sort of soup that keeps a household calm. It held chickpeas, leeks, herbs, and whatever greens the day allowed. A rind of cheese might go in for kindness. Numitor received visitors, but not in crowds. A shepherd might stop with news from the road. A cousin might bring olives and brine. Someone always seemed to leave with better manners than they arrived with. He did not rage in any story that survives. This may be editing, but it also feels likely. He had the serene patience of the world's first practitioner of strategic waiting. There is dignity in a man who knows the season will change without his assistance. He watches figs ripen. He hears crows in the trees. He allows time to do some heavy lifting. Children from nearby farms were not warned away from him. They brought walnuts in their hems and questions on their tongues. He answered with the relaxed courtesy of a grandfather long before he held that exact title. Sometimes he sat where the road bent toward the city gate. The dust would rise pale in the late sun. Carts creaked past with onions, amphorae, fleece, and always someone's opinion. He could see Alba Longa above him then. The walls glowed warm at dusk. Laurel smoke climbed into the evening air. The place was his and not his, which is an old human feeling. His title had been stripped with professional neatness. The city no longer named him king in public prayer. Messengers needed permission before bringing any official matter to his table. Yet title and respect are not twins. They resemble each other at feasts, but they keep different sleeping quarters. Numitor retained one long after the other was folded away. A farm account notes that he paid workers on time, even in poor harvest weeks. Another mentions extra wool issued before a cold spell. Small fairness has a way of traveling faster than decrees. Meanwhile, Amulius settled fully into the palace above the lake. On the surface, his court looked prosperous enough to sell confidence by the jar. Polished bowls shone, grain stores looked healthy, guests were seated promptly, the halls smelled of warm stone, perfumed oil, and the faint burnt sweetness of grain offerings. Fresh rushes covered the floors. Bronze door fittings caught the light in a way meant to reassure. You might almost have believed everything was stable if you ignored the speed of everyone's blinking. Prosperity sat there like a well-dressed guest. Nervousness stood just behind it, adjusting the cushions. Amulius favored abundance in visible places. Fruit appeared in high baskets. Honey cakes came out on feast days. Even the palace dogs looked sleek, though one suspects they had excellent lobbying skills. He also favored listening at inconvenient hours. Servants learned to keep footsteps soft near side rooms. Doors were opened with extreme care, which made the whole court seem oddly devoted to hinges. The royal augur became a frequent presence. He was an ink-stained man with worried shoulders, and a habit of arriving when nobody wanted clarity. He was Alba Longa's most accurate and least welcome app notification. Birds' lights were checked. Entrails were examined. The breeze above the altar was discussed with the solemnity of tax law. Each answer made Amulius less comfortable inside his own skin. The king perspired through meetings that did not require heat. He dabbed his neck with linen. He shifted his crooked gold wreath back into place, only for it to drift again a finger's width. Once a nurse carrying a very ordinary baby crossed the outer court during an omen reading. Amulius turned so fast that one sandal strap snapped. The child merely yawned and continued its distinguished public career. This is what fear does when it settles in properly. It stops looking for armies. It starts looking at cradles, cousins, and innocent bundles wrapped in striped cloth. The city learned his moods and adjusted. Midwives kept family news to family circles for a while. Men with ambitious nephews practiced faces of total harmlessness. Grandmothers became unexpectedly skilled at changing the subject. On festival days, the crowd still looked cheerful from a distance. Laurel smoke curled over the sacred ground, musicians played pipes, children licked honey from sticky fingers and stared at the royal seats. Up close, people watched the king watching them. That tiny extra layer of watching sat over every rite like a thin veil. It did not ruin the day, but everyone could feel the cloth. Amulius rewarded loyalty in highly visible ways. A supporter received a better house lot near the market. Another was granted mules from crown stock. Someone else married above expectation and thanked the gods very loudly. He also kept lists of less welcome matters. Which families still visited Numitor? Which old servants went out to the farm on rest days? Which branches of the bloodline had not yet been tidied into safety? The palace scribes copied these notes onto fresh wax before the old marks softened. Fingers smudged the edges. A lamp coughed soot onto one page, and the clerk carefully blew it away. That was part of the skill. Good oil in the lamps and good bread on the trays can make a regime feel almost wholesome. Still, a nervous kingdom develops little habits. Servants pause before names. Guests laugh a beat too late. Even the geese in the lower yard seem to complain more quietly, though that may be generous to the geese. At supper, Amulius ate well enough. There was roast kid on some evenings. There were lentils with herbs on others. There was always bread, and always the sense that he was chewing beside a prophecy. He had taken the throne and sealed the doors around it. He had thinned the rival line until it looked manageable. Yet management, like sweeping, only invites more dust. One branch remained in view even then. Numitor still lived beyond the walls. The bloodline still breathed through his household. The court's gaze had already begun to drift toward the women of that house. Here, the records become careful again. Careful records are often the loudest kind. They avoid a thing so politely that the shape of it stands up in full view. A note about sacred service appears beside a list of household restrictions. A name is copied twice. The head Vestal priestess added one brief remark in a margin. and one can almost feel the eyebrow. Her order was ancient, exacting, and not known for flexible scheduling. It was a 30-year employment contract with a very specific conduct clause. Human resources in Alba Longa had a decidedly sacred flavor. Amulius would soon make use of that structure with cold practicality. For now, he sat in his polished court and tried to enjoy being secure. This is often the least restful part of taking power. Below the palace, the crater lake stayed perfectly blue. Above the plain, the Tiber kept its silver line. The world continued its calm habits while men fussed over chairs, seals, and descendants. And on the farm outside the gate, Numitor waited with figures, weather, and his unhurried hands. The universe, he seemed to think, might yet prove him right. It only needed time and a little room. At first light, the palace stones still held the night's coolness under their pale dust. Laurel smoke drifted through the court, and the blue lake below Alba Longa lay still as polished glass. Rhea Silvia was brought through those halls without haste. She walked between two servants, who looked carefully at the floor, as if tiles were suddenly very interesting. She was Numitor's daughter, and that was enough to make every doorway feel narrower. In Alba Longa, family lines were counted like jars of grain, and watched with even greater worry. Amulius waited in a chamber that smelled of warm wool, lamp oil, and nervous sweat. His gold laurel wreath sat slightly crooked, as it usually did, like a crown that had heard troubling news. He had taken his brother's place on the throne some years before. It was ancient Latium's first hostile corporate takeover, complete with a family removal from the board. Numitor now lived outside the walls on a farm with fig trees and patient servants. He bore exile with the calm of the world's first practitioner of strategic waiting. That patience unnerved Amulius more than any complaint could have done. A quiet man on a farm can look very much like a future footnote, turning itself into destiny. So the king had thought long and damp thoughts about heirs. He thought about nephews not yet born, and infants who had not even begun misbehaving. He consulted the royal augur before breakfast, after supper, and on days that already felt unhelpful. The augur remained Alba Longa's most accurate and least welcome app notification. The ink-stained man watched birds, liver marks, and stray shadows with grave care. Then he announced with perfect timing that Numitor's line was not finished. This did not improve the king's complexion. It merely added a fresh glaze of alarm across his upper lip. A son from Numitor's house could one day gather friends, claim rights, and make speeches near gates. Amulius preferred a cleaner answer, or what kings call clean when they are making trouble sound tidy. Rhea Silvia was young, unmarried, and of the right blood to trouble him later. Therefore he chose a path that felt pious, legal, and deeply convenient for himself. A Vestal virgin could not marry while under vow. A Vestal virgin could not bear lawful children without turning the city upside down. It was a neat piece of royal thinking. If no heirs could appear, then no heirs could become a problem with small sandals and excellent ancestry. The Order of Vestals served Vesta, keeper of the holy fire. Their work stood at the heart of the city, which meant it looked sacred and practical at once. A priestess was both honored and managed very closely. It was a 30-year contract, with an extremely specific conduct clause and very little leave. Rhea heard the king's decision with a still face. Her hands stayed folded. Though one thumb pressed the other hard enough to whiten the nail, she knew what the choice meant before anyone explained it with nice words. Palace words often arrived dressed in linen and smelled faintly of trap. The head Vestal priestess came to receive her by midday. She wore clean white folds and a single raised eyebrow that could curdle sacred milk at 20 steps. Nothing escaped that eyebrow. It seemed to keep a private ledger of ritual errors going back 30 years, and perhaps several previous lifetimes. Rhea's old life began to come off in small, ordinary pieces. A servant loosened the pins in her hair, and dark strands slid over her shoulders like water. The room for preparation was plain and cool, and smelled of ash soap. A low stool stood near the wall, and bronze bowls waited with folded cloths inside. One older Vestal combed out Rhea's hair with patient fingers. Another held the bowl for the cut locks, because even grief benefits from practical arrangements. The cutting itself was quick. The sound was softer than she expected, like shears moving through dry reeds near a pond. A lock was lifted and laid aside with ceremony. Then another followed until the weight at the back of her neck was gone. She touched the new edge once, almost by surprise. Her fingers met rough ends where braids had been, and then she set her hand back in her lap. The white robe came next, clean and heavy, with a narrow woven border. Linen shifted against her skin with that faint dry whisper good cloth always makes. A belt was tied firmly around her waist. The folds were arranged again when they slipped, because sacred work and neat pleats were close relations. A veil was set over her trimmed hair and pinned into place. The cloth smelled faintly of cedar chestwood and sun from an old courtyard line. Rhea stood while the head Vestal checked each fold. The older woman's mouth barely moved, though that famous eyebrow performed a short and chilly sermon. Then came the oath. It was spoken in a room where smoke rose straight upward, which everyone took as a polite sign. She repeated the words in a clear voice that did not tremble. Service, chastity, obedience, years counted carefully, and the flame before all private wants. The vow stretched 30 years ahead of her. 30 years is a very long time when counted in winters, and longer still when counted in children never held. Yet the rite left little room for wandering thoughts. A priestess handed her a small dish of salted meal, and another adjusted her sleeve by a finger's width. Ceremony in Alba Longa loved details more than speed. The gods, it seemed, were thought to admire tidy edges and correct hand placement. When the initiation ended, afternoon light had shifted across the paving stones. Outside, the air held warm stone, burnt grain, and the far sweetness of crushed laurel leaves. Rhea was led to the Vestal's house near the sacred precinct. Its rooms were simple, swept, and bright in places where sunlight reached the plaster. Her sleeping space was narrow but clean. A woven mat, 2 folded blankets, a cedar chest, and a water jar made up most of its comfort. On the first morning there, she woke before dawn to another woman's quiet footstep. The house kept the hour by habit, not by kindness. The sacred flame was tended in a round chamber open high above. Cool air slipped down from the roof gap, and the fire breathed gently against it. At that hour, the embers glowed in soft orange pockets under pale ash. Rhea learned to stir them with a careful rod and add dry wood without fuss. Not every wood was fit for holy use. Bundles were sorted by size, dryness, and smell, and tied with plain cord that scratched the fingers. She learned where soot collected first on the stone lip. She learned how heat reddened the skin near the knuckles before it became true discomfort. The older Vestals moved around the hearth with calm economy. One brought fresh fuel, one swept stray dust, and one watched the flame with sleepy devotion. Rhea found comfort in the rule that every motion had a place. A fire that must never fail gives even sorrow a timetable. When the morning brightened, the chamber smelled of smoke and hot clay. Tiny sparks clicked now and then, like seeds tapping in a pan. She carried away ash in a shallow bronze tray. The tray warmed her palms through the cloth wrapped under its rim. Ash settled into every small line of the skin. Later, no matter how well she washed, a faint gray memory often stayed near the thumb. After the fire came the making of sacred salt. This work sounded grand and turned out to involve patient grinding and the sort of concentration lentils also require. Salt was dried, pounded, and mixed with toasted grain in exact measure. The grain had been prepared earlier, and it smelled warm and nutty as it cooled. Rhea worked at a hand mill with steady pressure from both palms. The stone made a low, soft scrape that became part of the room's breathing. Fine meal gathered in a neat, pale ring. The salt caught light in tiny points, as if modest stars had decided to assist with kitchen matters. The mixture would season offerings in later rites. For now it lived in bowls that needed covering against dust, curious insects, and casual elbows. Nothing in the Vestal's house was ever left askew for long. If a cloth sat crooked, someone noticed, and the eyebrow probably heard about it. Meals were plain, though not joyless. There was bread with a rough crust, bean mash with herbs, olives, and thin soup smelling of onion and leek. On better days, the soup held a little cheese or lentils softened nearly to cream. On colder days, steam fogged the bronze spoon and warmed the nose before the mouth. Rhea ate quietly with the others on low seats. Their cups were small, their talk modest, and their bread always seemed to shed patient crumbs. She missed the farm meals of her childhood with sudden force at odd moments. A fig split open, or a smell of goat milk, could do it. Numitor's house had been outside the walls near stony ground and orderly vines. The air there had room in it, and evenings carried insect song instead of temple echoes. News of him reached her only in scraps. A servant's cousin had seen him walking the boundary path, or buying seed, or mending a gate hinge himself. Such reports always ended the same way. He was well, he was calm, and he waited as if time worked for him. Rhea kept those little notices the way some people keep coins sewn in a hem, small, hidden, and useful when the spirit feels poor. There were processions on feast days, and those required a different kind of care. Sandals were checked for wear, hems were brushed, and veils were laid smooth. The Vestals walked in measured pace through streets washed earlier by servants with buckets. Damp stone gave back a cool smell under the warming sun. People made space for them without being told twice. Bakers paused with flour on their hands, and children stared until mothers lowered the small chins gently. Rhea carried sacred things when instructed, though often it was only a bowl or a folded cloth. Most holy life, she discovered, involved quite a lot of carrying. The city liked to look at Vestals as symbols. Symbols, sadly, still needed their sandals retied and their veils pinned against gusty corners. From the slope below the precinct, the plain opened wide in clear weather. The silver ribbon of the Tiber shone far off, thin and sure. Sometimes she glanced that way for one heartbeat too long. The head Vestal never missed it, and the eyebrow made a careful note. The vow itself sat inside every day like a second skeleton. It held the shape of meals, sleep, movement, and every future thought. 30 years were divided in the old teaching into stages of learning, doing, and guiding. To a new priestess, this sounded orderly and also rather endless. Rhea was at the first stage, where every task was watched. She folded blankets squarely, poured water carefully, and learned silence in the right proportions. The law around the vow was severe, in the way old laws enjoy being severe. Everyone knew that breaking it led to an ending nobody wished to describe over supper. So the warning lived mostly in glances and lowered voices. A place can teach fear without speaking above a murmur. Yet daily life softened even this hard edge with routine. Oil lamps needed trimming, robes needed mending, and cold floors still required ordinary feet. Rhea patched a worn seam one afternoon beside an older priestess with failing eyesight. Sunlight moved over the thread basket and dust turned lazily in the beam. The basket held white wool, undyed linen, a bone needle case, and one cracked spindle. Such objects gave honest company because they asked for hands, not conclusions. At night she lay on her mat and listened to the house settle. Timber clicked faintly, someone coughed in another room, and a jar rang when touched by chance. She did not weep often, which surprised her at first. Grief had become less like rain and more like a stone kept warm under clothing. She had small private ways of remaining herself. None would have impressed a poet, but all would have been recognized by any daughter denied a choice. She took an extra moment over the morning wash. She folded one undertunic with the farm habit her nurse had taught her, not the temple way. She saved the smoothest crust for last. She stood where a sliver of late sun reached the wall, even when a shadier place was free. These were not rebellions fit for legend. They were human measures taken against the feeling of being arranged by other people. One spring day, during a procession route near old garden walls, she saw a small red flower growing through a crack. It was no marvel, just a field poppy with a bent stem. She noticed it because the red was startling among the pale dust. The color looked almost impertinent, as if the ground had made a private joke. Later, when the others moved inside by a side door, she turned back for a breath. 2 fingers were enough to lift the flower carefully from its thin root bed. She hid it in the fold of her sleeve until evening. The petals bruised a little, but the stem held, and that felt like useful company. In her room, she placed it in a tiny cup with 2 fingers of water. The cup usually held lamp oil, and therefore entered a brief second career as a vase. The flower became her quiet companion. Each morning she checked whether the petals still opened, and each night she straightened the leaning stem. It was not disobedience of any heroic kind. It was simply a living thing, chosen by her own hand, which is sometimes enough to steady a day. The head Vestal nearly found it once while inspecting robes and storage jars. Her eyebrow lifted, hovered near the cup, and then turned instead toward a misfolded cloth. Rhea thanked every household god she had ever heard named, including a few that were probably local spoons. Relief can make a theologian of anyone. The flower lasted longer than seemed fair. A petal fell on the 4th day, then another on the 6th, pale at the edges like worn paint. She kept the fallen pieces wrapped in a scrap of linen. Dry petals weigh almost nothing, yet they can fill a room in the mind. So the weeks settled around her. Fire at dawn, salt by measure, robes to shake free of dust, processions, meals, and the close company of vows. Amulius, meanwhile, continued to perspire through state business with admirable consistency. He was a man who read one prophecy and never emotionally recovered. Whenever an infant cried somewhere in the city, he seemed to hear a legal challenge. No cradle in Alba Longa was, in his view, entirely innocent. Rhea heard these things through servants who pretended not to gossip while describing them in extraordinary detail. Even sacred houses enjoy a modest information network. The royal augur still delivered his accurate discomforts on schedule. Every omen intended to soothe the king somehow returned wearing sharper shoes. None of this changed her tasks. The flames still wanted dry wood, and the bowls still required clean hands. That steadiness became its own strange shelter. When a life is narrowed, even repetition can start to feel like a form of room. She learned the scent of fresh ash before sunrise. She learned the exact weight of the bronze ladle when full and when nearly empty. She learned which floor stones held cold longest in winter. She learned that linen dried fastest where the courtyard took the midday light. These were humble kinds of knowledge. They entered the body quietly and stayed there like songs learned too young to remember learning. Rhea also learned that dignity can be very plain. It may look like standing straight while a belt is tied by someone else. It may look like speaking the oath without adding tears for decoration. It may look like keeping a flower alive in a borrowed cup. In that house of rule and smoke, she was not defeated into softness. She was shaped into patience, which is related to softness only from a distance. If she thought of her father, she pictured his hands among vine stakes or fig branches. She pictured him glancing toward the city and then returning to his work. That image did not make her less sad. It made her sorrow orderly, which is often the most one can ask from it. Evening on the Alban slope came with long shadows and the smell of cooking fires below. The lake darkened slowly, and the plain lost detail one field at a time. Rhea stood once at the threshold after closing duties and watched that fading light. Her veil stirred lightly at the cheek, then rested again. Behind her, the sacred fire kept its calm red breathing. The city waited in its own old smoke and silence. She turned back inside with the others when called. The door closed softly, and the night's work began. Before sunrise, Rhea Silvia dresses by the glow of one low lamp in the Vestal house. She pulls a soft wool tunic over her head. She smooths the cloth at the hips. She ties the belt, with careful fingers that know the knot in darkness. Her white head veil waits on a peg by the door. Her shoes stand side by side on the floor. A folded strip of red wool rests near the lamp like a small sleeping snake. The house is cool at that hour. The plaster walls hold the night a little longer. Ash from the sacred hearth smells dry and faintly sweet. Outside, Alba Longa still sits half in blue shadow. The crater lake below the hills lies flat and still. Far off, the Tiber shows itself as a thin silver thread. Rhea Silvia begins as she always begins. She checks the fire. She lifts the bronze spoon. She turns cakes of meal on a clean board. Her work has the plain rhythm of temple life. Water is fetched. Lamps are trimmed. Linens are shaken and folded into even squares that please the eye. There is comfort in rules when one lives among rules. A bowl goes here, a jar goes there. The head veil must fall just so over the brow. The head Vestal priestess notices such things with heroic dedication. She can spot one crooked pin across a courtyard. Her raised eyebrow could curdle sacred milk at 10 paces. For some weeks, small changes have begun to gather around Rhea, like dust at a threshold. She pauses halfway up the temple steps. She presses a hand to the wall. She turns away from boiling barley with a look usually reserved for bad fish. At first the other women say nothing. Temple houses teach silence very well. Silence there is folded and stacked almost as neatly as the blankets. One morning she leaves half her bread untouched. Another morning she loosens her belt after the noon rites. The belt has never before been a subject of debate. The older Vestal who keeps the linen chest sees it first. She sees the knot tied higher. She sees the tunic fall differently over the body beneath. Nothing dramatic follows. There's no dropped cup. There's no cry. There's only a stillness as soft and heavy as wool. The chest lid stays open. A folded cloth remains in 2 hands. A fly taps at the window frame and suddenly sounds very busy. Rhea Silvia stands with one palm over her middle. The room smells of soap ash and sun-warmed flax. Her face has gone pale under the morning light. The timing is the heart of it. Vestals live under close eyes and stricter walls. Their days are counted by bells, duties, and the sort of schedule modern offices only dream about. It is, in other words, a 30-year, non-negotiable employment contract. It comes with a very specific conduct clause. The exit package is not one anybody wants to discuss over lunch. Rhea Silvia has not been left to wander freely. She goes to rites, she goes to the well, she goes where a servant, priestess, or custom goes with her. So the women begin to count backwards in their heads. They count feast days, they count moon turns, they count tiny absences that once seemed harmless and now glow with meaning. A copper basin stands between them on the floor. Water in it holds the window in a trembling square. No one touches it. When the head Vestal is called, she arrives at once. She does not hurry in a visible way, yet somehow the air has already become tidier before she reaches the door. She looks at Rhea Silvia, she looks at the belt, she looks at a wax tablet where temple dates are marked in tiny, careful strokes. Then comes that eyebrow. It rises by 1 grave degree. A lesser city might have taken it for an earthquake warning. She asks practical questions first. Has the monthly bleeding stopped? When did the sickness begin? Who has seen the girl alone and where? Rhea Silvia answers with a voice kept very even. The linen woman stares at the floor. Somewhere in the hall a broom keeps sweeping, because old habits are hard to interrupt. The silence after the answers is stranger than anger. It is not empty. It is full of numbers, rules, prayers, and the blunt fact of a body announcing itself. News does not run in a temple house. It seeps. It goes under doors and around corners. It clings to veils and wooden trays and the handles of water jars. By noon, the kitchen servants are whispering over lentil broth. By evening, 2 guards at the outer gate are suddenly very interested in the moral life of priestesses. The city takes the rumor with a careful face. Alba Longa is used to omens. It is less used to omens that ask awkward questions at dinner. In the market, a fish seller says nothing for 3 whole breaths. This is remarkable enough to deserve a small inscription of its own. Bread is weighed, figs are sorted, a potter keeps turning his wheel. Yet every ordinary act carries that faint extra pressure, as if everyone is listening for a second sentence. Rhea Silvia says little at first. She sits on a low stool by the inner wall. Her hands rest in her lap, with the patience of someone waiting for weather to settle. She is not a girl who dramatizes her own breathing. She knows the weight of ritual speech. She knows words can land on a life like stones. So the first part of the matter belongs to quiet. It belongs to measured steps in a flagged courtyard. It belongs to women noticing that impossible things do not become less impossible because supper still needs salt. Outside the city walls, the sacred grove of Mars waits in its old place. It lies beyond a narrow track where carts wear 2 pale lines into the earth. Laurel trees crowd the path. Their leaves hold sun on one side and cool shadow on the other. There is a spring there that never seems in a rush. Water rises clear over dark pebbles. It slides into a shallow basin edged with moss and hoofprints. An altar stands near the spring. Its top has been worn smooth by years of hands, cups, oil, and little cakes set down with care. The stone is not grand. It is low and broad. Its corners have softened under weather, like bread edges left near heat. Rhea Silvia had gone there often enough. The grove belonged to the city, and also to older feelings than the city. Such places are both public and deeply private. A narrow ribbon from some past offering still hangs from a branch. One strip is red, one is faded almost to pink. A tiny clay cup lies on its side in the needles. The smell there is different from the temple court. Laurel sharpens the air. Wet stone cools it again. Smoke from burnt grain offerings drifts in threads through the trunks. If a person stood there at midday, sandals would feel the warm dust first. Then damp ground near the spring would darken the soles with a clean chill. Birds nest above the altar. Bees work the small flowers at the edge of the clearing. Every few moments a leaf lets go and spins down as if time has loosened its grip. Mars, in that older country faith, is not only the hard god later statues prefer. He belongs to spring as much as iron. He belongs to fresh growth, to young strength, to fields waking, to the guarded edge where wild and sown land meet. His places often sit a little outside neat walls. They are reached by paths rather than paved display. They smell of earth and leaf and animal breath. At this grove, shepherd boys leave little knots of wool. Women leave cakes sweetened with honey when they can spare it. Soldiers are not the only men who know his name. Rhea Silvia had walked there in the early season. The city behind her had smelled of warm stone and kitchen smoke. Burnt grain from a morning rite lingered in her hair. She carried a small basket on her arm. In it were meal cakes, a strip of wool, and a narrow flask stoppered with wax. Her sandals picked up dust at the gate. Then the path cooled under shade. The movement from sun to grove felt like stepping from a bright yard into a room where someone kind had lowered the noise. No escort stood at her elbow every moment. Sacred errands could create little pockets of trust. Ritual life runs on trust because no one can supervise a soul all day. That was part of the trouble later. It was not freedom exactly. It was simply one of those human gaps that exist in every careful system. At the spring, she washed her hands. She sprinkled water over the altar. She set down the cakes one by one so their round edges would not crack. She tied the wool to a low branch. She poured a little oil. She spoke words the grove had heard many times before, with names older than the hands that shaped them. Then she stayed longer than planned. The day was warm. The grove held a pleasant dimness. Water moved with a sound like someone pouring steadily into a cup. There is no need to make such a place theatrical. Ancient Latium did not require smoke machines. It already had light through leaves, which is superior and less expensive. Rhea Silvia later said that the moment began in a softness. A shadow shifted where no one stood. The air turned warmer against her skin. She did not say there was a crash. She did not say the earth split open. Her account had the quiet manners of a dream remembered afternoon. She had knelt near the altar. Her hand still rested on the stone. The stone had felt sun-warm under her palm, then warmer still, as if life moved upward through it. The laurel leaves, she said, stopped answering the breeze. The spring kept flowing, yet even that plain sound seemed to step back a little. Then came a presence. That was the word she returned to most often. Not a shape fully seen, not a face clearly held. A presence, near and immense, like standing before a fire with closed eyes. She spoke of a shadow with a red depth inside it. She spoke of warmth around her shoulders. She spoke of a voice felt first in the chest and only then in the ear. The voice did not chatter. Gods in old stories rarely waste syllables. They have the efficiency of people who know everyone will repeat them afterward. Rhea Silvia said it named her. It called her daughter of kings and keeper of fire. It told her not to fear the burden that would come. When she said these things later, she kept her gaze on the floor. Her hands were very still. Only her thumb moved once along the edge of her sleeve. She remembered the smell of crushed laurel. She remembered the damp hem of her tunic where it brushed the spring edge. She remembered warmth settling over her like a heavy cloak at evening. After that, memory turned thin. She spoke of light through leaves. She spoke of waking or rising, though she could not say which word fit better. The basket still stood beside her. One cake had broken in half. A beetle climbed the altar stone with the deep seriousness of a temple clerk. She returned before dusk. Dust marked the lower edge of her tunic. A thread from the wool ribbon clung to her wrist. No one stopped her with questions then. Sacred errands ended every day. A woman could come back quiet from prayer without causing a citywide emergency. So she folded her veil. She washed the flask. She went on with the common tasks that hold houses together while myths quietly take root underneath them. When the signs of pregnancy could no longer be folded away with the linens, her account changed from private memory into public defense. The head Vestal heard the claim with a face carved from disbelief and duty. Her first response was not poetry, it was procedure, which was very much her love language. She asked where, she asked when, she asked who else had been present. The answer to the last question did not improve her mood. A sacred grove, a god, and an impossible child were not the kind of temple paperwork she preferred. She liked clean ledgers, measured oil, and ash where ash ought to be. Yet the claim itself was not absurd in the way a later age might assume. The old Latin world had room for porous borders between mortal and divine. People already told of gods at springs, gods at doors, gods brushing the edges of sleep. A dream could matter. A strange warmth during sacrifice could become a family story, and then a local shrine. The line between sign and visit was not painted in thick modern paint. It was more like chalk on stone after a rain, still visible and yet softly blurred. A child with unusual parentage did not break the map of belief. It fit within it, if uneasily, like a new jar finding space on a crowded shelf. Farmers prayed to powers they could not see. Mothers tied charms over cradles. Old men swore that a bird had once spoken at a boundary stone. No one in Alba Longa lived inside a sealed world. The divine was expected to leak in around the edges, especially where trees, water, and old bloodlines met. So when Rhea Silvia said Mars had come to her, people frowned, they gossiped, they doubted details. Yet the idea itself found places to sit down. In a baker's yard, two women agreed that gods had always had poor timing. Then they went back to slapping dough into neat rounds. At a fountain, a girl whispered the story while balancing a jar on her hip. The jar left a wet ring on her tunic, because history rarely waits for better posture. Even the palace servants handled the tale with mixed caution and curiosity. One maid crossed herself in the old way, another asked whether divine children kicked harder than ordinary ones. Meanwhile, Amulius received the news in a shaded room, with painted walls, and no comfort in any of them. His gold laurel wreath sat slightly crooked as usual. Sweat gathered at his temples with the punctual devotion of a loyal employee. He was a man who had read one prophecy and never emotionally recovered. Every infant cry in Alba Longa sounded to him like a memo from fate. His seizure of the throne had already made him jumpy. Ancient Latium's first hostile corporate takeover had removed the founding family from the board and rewritten the Vestal policy for maximum inconvenience. Now a royal Vestal was with child. Now she spoke the name of Mars. Now the old line, which he had tried so hard to fold away, seemed to be unfolding itself again. He did not shout at once. Cold dread often arrives in better clothes than panic. It sits down before anyone else and asks for watered wine. The roux smelled of wax, warmed bronze in his anxious skin. A fly worried at a fig left on a tray. No one was brave enough to swat it. He sent for the royal augur. The augur came with ink on his fingers and a look already apologetic. He always looked as if he had brought unfortunate weather in his sleeve by mistake. Birds were watched, signs were taken, sacred words were spoken in that patient, careful tone used by men who know accuracy will not make them popular. This augur had a gift for being correct in the most inconvenient direction possible. He was Alba Longa's most accurate and least welcome app notification. The signs, he said, did not reject the claim. They pointed instead toward greatness joined to danger. They suggested sons. They suggested founders. At that word, Amulius went very still. The crooked wreath slipped a little farther to one side. A line of sweat moved down his neck. He looked like a man trying to outstare a storm cloud. The head Vestal received this confirmation with the indignation of someone forced to admit that a broken cup had predicted the weather. She did not soften, she did not warm, yet even she could not dismiss an omen properly read and properly repeated. Rhea Silvia was questioned again, and gently this time, which in that house counted as a minor miracle. She spoke of the grove, she spoke of the shadow, she spoke of the warmth in the voice, and then she said no more than she had to. Her restraint helped her. Wild invention would have sounded cheap. Plain memory, offered without adornment, sat in the room and refused to leave. Some thought she had dreamed and made meaning from the dream. Some thought Mars had chosen a royal body for royal work. Some wisely kept their thoughts to themselves in polished bowls. Numitor heard the rumor on his farm, outside the walls by evening. He sat under the eaves with a cup in his hand. He listened. He nodded once, with the serene patience of the world's first practitioner of strategic waiting. He did not rush to the city. He did not fling up his arms. He simply looked toward Alba Longa as if the universe had finally remembered an appointment. Back within the walls, days went on in their ordinary clothes. Grain had to be ground. Oil had to be measured. Temple floors still collected the same old dust. Rhea Silvia's body changed with calm insistence. Her tunics were let out a little. Her stools were brought closer to the hearth. Someone added more fennel to her soup. The soup itself became a small household matter. Lentils were boiled until soft. Leeks were sliced thin. A bit of garlic went in, and sometimes a scrap of cheese if the kitchen felt generous. She ate slowly. She preferred bread dipped in broth. Sour things pleased her more than sweet ones, which caused brief debate among the servants and solved nothing. The women around her grew used to the fact. Familiarity does that to wonders. Even miracles must eventually fit around laundry days and missing pins. Yet the story of Mars kept spreading, because it attached itself to places people already loved. Men pointed toward the grove when they passed the outer path. Children dared one another to touch the altar and run back before sunset. Old women nodded as if springs had always known more than city councils. Offerings increased a little. More ribbons hung on the branches. Someone set down a tiny bronze spear no longer than a hand, polished bright as a new thought. The grove accepted all of it without comment. Water kept rising through stone. Laurel leaves kept shining dark green above the altar. When evening came, the city smelled of cook fires and cooling earth. Laurel smoke drifted from a shrine. The lake below held the last light in one smooth blue sheet. In the Vestal house, Rhea Silvia folded a linen cloth over her knees. She rested both hands on the life beneath it. Her face looked tired and oddly peaceful. Outside, the rumor moved softly from doorway to doorway. Inside, bowls were stacked, lamps were turned down, sandals were set in pairs for mourning. No one yet knew how large the story would become. For now it was still held in small things. It lived in the worn altar stone. It lived in one woman's careful voice. It lived in the nervous damp of a king who had every reason to dislike prophecy. And so Alba Longa settled around the impossible, as people usually do. It made room at the table. It passed the bread. It waited for the children to arrive. Before sunrise, the birthing room smelled of hot water, wool, and faint laurel smoke from the shrine below. A bronze lamp burned with a steady little flame. Its light sat on the plaster walls like warm honey. He stood near the inner door with a wax tablet. The rush mat underfoot felt rough through the thin sole of a sandal. Outside, Alba Longa still held its breath before dawn. The crater lake below the hill lay flat and blue as polished stone. A servant passed with folded linens over both arms. Another carried a bowl of oil that smelled of herbs and clean hands. In the next room, someone had set water to heat again. The pot lid clicked softly with each small bubble. Rhea Silvia labored behind the curtain, with the stubborn patience of a young woman who had not been asked. The head Vestal priestess moved in and out like a storm cloud in white wool. Her raised eyebrows suggested the universe had become very untidy. She checked the ribbons at the room shrine. She straightened a ladle that was already straight. Her mouth thinned at every small delay. Her silence said more than most speeches managed in a full afternoon. The first cry came low and wet and strong. It was not the thin complaint of a weak child. It was the voice of a creature announcing in simple terms that air would now be taken seriously. The midwife lifted the boy into a cloth with steady hands. Steam rose from the basin beside her wrist. The second cry followed so quickly that everyone turned at once. The room did not fill with panic. It filled with a strange, alert stillness. Even the lamp seemed to listen. Twin births were never only one thing in Latium. People liked them best when they happened in other families. 2 babies from one labor could mean doubled blessing. They could also mean doubled trouble, which sounded efficient in a grim way. Old women at market would happily offer both opinions before finishing one basket of onions. No one felt the need to settle the matter. The second boy arrived broad in the shoulders for a newborn. His fists opened and closed as if testing the world. The midwife laughed once through her nose. She had seen many babies, and these 2 were making her revise her categories. They were washed in warm water that had gone pink with birth. They were rubbed with cloth that had been dried by the hearth. Their hair lay dark and damp against small heads. Their skin glowed red with effort and very solid life. One boy quieted only when wrapped tightly from chest to heel. The other pushed a foot free almost at once. It took 2 women to keep both cloths neat. The cloths lost that struggle in a matter of breaths. When the boys were laid side by side, they turned toward each other. Their noses twitched at the same moment. Their eyes opened early and too clearly. Newborn eyes often wandered like sleepy fish. These eyes seemed to fix on light and shape. Palace servants exchanged glances over the cradle and then looked away. The cradle itself had been fetched in haste from the storeroom. It still smelled faintly of cedar shavings and old blanket chests. A nurse tucked lamb's wool along the sides. Another adjusted the small leather ties beneath the handles. The boys filled the space more fully than anyone liked to admit. They looked less borrowed from heaven than delivered with intent. Rhea Silvia lay pale and spent against the pillows. Sweat cooled on her temples in the dim room. A cup of watered wine waited by her hand. The rim held the print of dried salt from another hand entirely. She asked to see them again before sleep took her. Her voice came thin, but it did not tremble. The first boy rooted impatiently. The second made a face of solemn disapproval, as if milk service had been delayed. The women smiled despite themselves. Even the priestess let one corner of her mouth nearly forgive the morning. A name had not yet been spoken aloud. For a while they were only the twins, which already felt like enough burden. The city below was waking by then. Smoke lifted from cook fires in narrow blue lines. Barley cakes went onto hot stones. Goats complained from pens with the deep personal offense of goats everywhere. The news traveled faster than good sandals. It crossed courtyards on wet buckets and flour-dusted sleeves. By the time the eastern sky turned pale gold, the palace knew 2 sons had been born. King Amulius heard it while breaking bread over a small breakfast tray. He had figs, goat cheese, and the appetite of a worried sparrow. He set down the bread without finishing it. A drop of watered wine darkened the table near his thumb. Amulius was a man who had read one prophecy and never emotionally recovered. His gold laurel wreath was, as usual, slightly crooked. He touched it before asking any question, as if straight metal might straighten fate. It did not, though points were awarded for effort. He asked how many children. The servant answered carefully, as if counting across thin ice. When she said 2 sons, the king's face changed in small ways first. His lips pressed flat. Moisture appeared at his temples. The room had not grown warmer, though Amulius often behaved as if weather conspired personally against him. He asked whether they were healthy. The servant said very healthy and immediately regretted the honesty. It was not the answer he wanted. Weakness would have soothed him in its own sad little way. Instead, he heard strength, and strength slid at once into prophecy. He heard danger in a baby's healthy lungs. He rose so quickly that his stool scraped the floor. A hound under the table lifted its head and then returned to sleep. The dog had the wise calm of Numitor in exile. It trusted time more than men did. Amulius crossed the chamber with short, quick steps. His sandals tapped the stone in a dry, anxious rhythm. He ordered the royal augur brought at once. Then he ordered the order repeated, which added nothing but sweat. The augur arrived with ink on 2 fingers, and sleep still clinging to one eyelid. He smelled faintly of rush pens and stale smoke. He carried a folded cloth case with his tools. He also carried the fate of the morning, which was less convenient. In Alba Longa, he was known for 2 gifts. He was always accurate and never welcome. He was, in that sense, Alba Longa's most accurate and least welcome app notification. Every alert from him made the day worse. The king did not meet him in the public hall. He chose a small upper terrace near the sacred birds. From there the plain opened westward in pale light. The Tiber lay far off like a thin strip of silver thread. An altar stood against the parapet with old ash in the cracks. Nearby sat a bowl of grain and a jug of water. The augur washed his hands before speaking. He dried them on a linen cloth already worn at the edge. Amulius paced while the man prepared the signs. His wreath shifted farther off center with each turn. Below them a baker slapped dough on a board. Somewhere in the court a mule sneezed with excellent timing. The augur marked a space and lifted his staff. He watched the sky with the rigid care of a man reading tiny legal text. Birds crossed the morning in ordinary ways at first. A pair of crows moved low over the wall. Then higher up, two kites circled apart and then together. Their shadows slid briefly over the terrace stones. He frowned at one point, and then, unhelpfully, frowned more. A swallow darted under the eaves and out again. Grain husks rolled against the parapet in a soft breeze. Amulius wanted certainty with clean edges. Ancient omens preferred suggestion, pattern, and a great deal of human sweating. At last the augur lowered his staff. He kept his eyes on the sky for one extra breath. That small delay said enough already. The king's fingers tightened around the fold of his robe. The augur spoke quietly, because quiet bad news lands with more weight. Loud bad news is merely rude. He said the signs confirmed unusual force in the birth. He said twin sons bore the mark of founders and rivals. He said the birds favored a line displaced but not ended. He said what was set aside would return with increase. He did not say Numitor's name at first. He did not need to. Amulius heard his brother all through the report. He heard the farm outside the walls, the old king's calm, and the insult of patience. Numitor, after all, was the world's first practitioner of strategic waiting. He could sit beside a fig tree and let history come to him. The augur finally named the danger, as plainly as his office allowed. These children stood under a hard, bright promise. If allowed to grow, they would alter the order of the house. The house in question belonged, inconveniently, to Amulius. The king asked whether ritual could turn the sign aside. His voice tried on steadiness, and did not wear it well. The augur considered the altar, the birds, and his own survival. Then he answered with painful honesty. Offerings might soften tempers in heaven. They would not erase what heaven had already written in broad daylight. A bead of sweat ran along Amulius's jaw and disappeared into his beard. He did not wipe it away. For one long moment he stared at the grain bowl. Each pale kernel looked absurdly innocent. Then he asked whether twins were always dangerous. The augur said no, though the word brought little comfort. Sometimes twins became priests. Sometimes they became farmers, herdsmen, or men known only to their dogs. Sometimes they became stories. The king did not enjoy the sound of that category. A swallow returned and tapped its wing against the eave. The noise was tiny and sharp. Amulius flinched as if the bird had named him. Fear had narrowed the world to anything that moved. When the augur was dismissed, he bowed low and backed away carefully. Accuracy had once again ruined a perfectly decent morning. Amulius remained on the terrace alone. The jug water had gone warm in the sun. He drank from it and still felt dry. Fear can be very talented that way. Below, ordinary palace work went on with almost insulting steadiness. Brooms moved dust into corners. A girl beat rugs against a wall and raised small clouds. A cook tied leeks with twine and complained about onions. In the birthing room, the twins had their first feeding. Milk dribbled down one chin and into the cloth. The nurse dabbed it away with the corner of a soft rag. The boy objected as if robbed of treasure. His brother sneezed twice and then slept. His sleep had the heavy confidence of a child who expected to wake to the same world. The women weighed them by feel and muttered over their size. Both boys seemed built from generous handfuls. Their wrists were thick for newborns. Their cries rose full and rounded from deep little chests. One had a calm stare that unsettled people more than crying would have done. The other kicked at every rap with determined outrage. Neither looked easy to misplace. Neither looked borrowed for a short stay. A palace maid with flower on her sleeve peered in and crossed herself the old local way. She said they looked as if they had arrived already 3 months late and annoyed by the delay. No one argued. Word slipped into the kitchens by noon. It came with a basket of lentils and left with a tray of bowls. Soon the women chopping herbs knew. Soon the scullions knew, though they pretended not to listen. In the kitchen, a pot of bean soup thickened near the fire. Onion skins stuck to a wet board. A cook broke stale bread into smaller pieces for later thickening. She nodded toward the inner rooms and said, "Strong boys bring luck." Another woman said, "Strong boys bring noise first." This was treated as the more practical reading. Neither woman sounded frightened. They spoke the way people speak about weather and cousins. At the stables, a groom rubbing down a mare heard the tale next. The horse flicked an ear and kept chewing hay. He said twins meant the gods could count to 2 after all. The joke was poor, but the mare seemed tolerant. He tightened a girth strap on a saddle, not needed until evening. Leather creaked softly in the cool shade. Nearby, a stable boy polished a bronze bit with wool and ash. He asked whether the boys had names yet. No one knew. That only improved the story. At the water stair, carriers filled jars and shifted them to waiting shoulders. Water sloshed in dark clay mouths. They talked about the babies while catching breath between trips. One woman said healthy infants sound like geese with ambition. Another said geese were at least useful. She received 3 tired smiles and a place in line. No one lowered a voice for fear. If anything, voices warmed around the tale. The city had lived too long under a king who mistrusted lullabies. A pair of loud babies felt almost refreshing. Even among those loyal to the throne, the whisper carried a different flavor. It tasted of curiosity, not dread. People asked who had the broader forehead. They asked whose cry came first and who slept longer. Such details cling to a birth more stubbornly than formal decrees. Human beings will always choose cheeks over policy. By afternoon, one kitchen girl swore the first boy had gripped her finger with heroic purpose. She had not been allowed near the cradle. A porter claimed both infants stared at him like magistrates. He had only passed the doorway carrying firewood. Facts wandered a little, as facts do. Still, the mood remained oddly light. Alba Longa had the air of the original Rome-adjacent startup. It was the mother city, and everyone sensed it had future branding issues. Old women in the service court remembered family lines better than official records did. They spoke of Numitor in low, comfortable tones. They said he was still on his farm beyond the walls. They said his olive trees had done well that year. One woman recalled buying cheese from his people in spring. Another said his goats were fat and rude. This was how hope moved in such places. It wore plain shoes and discussed livestock. Back in the palace, Amulius tried to eat a noon meal. The tray held cold chicken, olives, and a pear split neatly in half. He managed 1 olive and half a sip of watered wine. Everything else sat untouched like furniture. He asked whether the infants still cried. A servant said yes, at proper intervals. He asked whether they cried loudly. The servant made the error of answering yes again. To most ears, this meant sturdy lungs and a nurse's full day. To Amulius, it meant destiny using indoor voices. He sent 2 men to stand near the birthing chamber. He called it caution, and wore that word very hard. Then he asked whether anyone had visited Rhea Silvia. He disliked the answer before it came. The head Vestal priestess had gone in twice, had looked, carved, from old disapproval. This pleased the king for a moment. Few things in life were more reliable than her moral bookkeeping, yet even she had not ordered the babies hidden from sight. Ritual outrage had limits when confronted by warm-breathing children. Amulius dismissed the servants and sat alone. Outside his chamber, sandals passed and faded. He picked up the pear and put it down again. Its cut side had browned slightly in the air. He thought of the augur's words in loops. Founders, return, increase. The room smelled of wax, warm stone, and his own uneasy skin. Fear has a way of becoming the strongest perfume. He tried prayer next, which was unlike him only in timing. He promised grain, oil, and public thanks. The gods, however, had already received grain from him many times. Burnt offerings are not a refund system. By late afternoon, the twins had been washed again and rewrapped in fresh cloth. The first set had already lost the battle with milk. A nurse rubbed each tiny foot with oil to keep the skin from drying. The soles were pink and absurdly complete. Romulus was named first by one whispering attendant. Remus followed almost at once, as if the names had been waiting nearby. Once spoken, they fitted with suspicious ease. Names do that when stories are already stretching awake. The boys seemed to settle under them. One slept with his fist tucked under his cheek. The other pushed his blanket down and had to be covered again. Nurses in every age discover the same small enemy. When evening shadows reached the inner court, Amulius asked for a fresh report. He received more health, more appetite, more vigor. The king listened with the expression of a man being handed invoices from fate. Every ordinary detail offended him. Strong suckling meant strength. Good sleep meant strength. Loud crying meant strength. Calm watching meant somehow also strength. He rose and went himself to the corridor outside the chamber. He did not cross the threshold. From behind the curtain came one sharp infant cry. Then another answered. The sounds were brief and common. They were the sort of sounds that usually make grown people smile without asking permission. Amulius stood very still and heard them as a challenge. Fear had tuned him to a single cruel station. He imagined the cradle as a small wooden siege engine. He imagined swaddling cloth as a banner not yet raised. This was not reason. This was prophecy fermenting in a warm mind. He turned away before anyone inside could greet him. His robe hem brushed the rushes with a dry whisper. A torch smoked in the wall ring. Someone nearby was grinding grain for the evening porridge. These were the quiet sounds of a household closing its day. They should have soothed him. Instead, his thought hardened into shape at last. The twins represented everything the signs had promised. They were Numitor's line returned in doubled form. They were the future arriving with two voices instead of one. By the time the first stars showed above the Alban hills, Amulius had arranged the thought into policy. Ancient Latium had seen its first hostile corporate takeover already. This was simply the follow-up memo nobody wanted to receive. He told himself he acted for the safety of the throne. He told himself kingdoms required clean decisions and closed doors. He did not say the simpler truth aloud. He was afraid of two babies in a cedar cradle. That fear settled on him like a second cloak. It was warmer than evening and twice as heavy. He summoned a trusted servant after dark. The lamp between them hissed softly in its oil. His words came low and flat now. Once fear makes a plan, it often grows calm. The servant listened with eyes fixed on the floor. Outside, somewhere in the palace, one of the twins cried again. It was only the sound of hunger. In the king's ear, it was the whole future asking to be fed. So the decision, by then, no longer wavered. Romulus and Remus must not be allowed to remain among the living. The city slept under mild stars and ordinary smoke. In one room, two boys breathed and dreamed of nothing at all. What lingers most kindly from this long and careful night is not the fear in the palace, but the strange softness around it. There is that close inner room first. The lamps burn low there. The air holds laurel smoke and warm wax. Amulius stands beneath his own painted ancestors. His gold wreath sits a little crooked, as usual. It gives him the look of a man dressed for confidence and arriving with none. He is still, damp at the temples, and very quiet. He is a man who read one prophecy and never emotionally recovered. Even now he speaks as if the walls themselves might be listening for heirs. The order comes in private. It comes almost gently. That is part of what makes it so cold. No trumpet sounds, no guard shouts, no public sentence is nailed to a post. There is only a basket brought in by steady hands. It is wicker, close woven, and plain. It is the sort of thing that might usually hold bread or figs or folded cloth. Tonight it is lined with wool instead. A small blanket is laid inside. Another cloth is tucked around the sides. Someone, perhaps from habit, perhaps from pity, takes care that the weave will not scratch tender skin. Ancient Latium could be very odd that way. It could arrange a terrible act with the neatness of pantry work. The servant chosen for the task is chosen for his silence. He is not the strongest man in the palace. He is not the cruelest man either. He is simply known for doing what is placed before him and not discussing it over supper. In Alba Longa, the original Rome-adjacent startup, that counted as a professional skill. Somewhere down the hall, the head Vestal priestess is almost certainly still holding her ledger of offenses inside her mind. Somewhere beyond the city, Numitor waits on his farm with the calm of the world's first practitioner of strategic waiting. But in this room, the only thing that matters is the basket, the order, and the pair of infants who have already become a political problem before they can hold up their own heads. Then there is the river. The story slows there, and it widens. All evening the Tiber has been rising with the spring flood. From the hills it had looked like a silver ribbon over the plain. Near its edge it is no ribbon at all. It is a broad, brown force. The banks are gone beneath it. The usual lines of mud and grass have vanished. Reeds lean and shiver in water that has climbed too high. Branches turn in the current like loose stalks. The servant comes down to that water with the basket in both arms. He has walked from stone courts into open night. He has left behind smoke, orders, and walls. He stands where the ground should have begun and finds only flood. His sandals sink into soaked earth. Cold water pushes around his ankles. The basket shifts a little with the weight of its living cargo. It is such a small movement. It is enough. There is the exact moment of hesitation. It is almost nothing to watch. A breath stays in the chest one beat too long. Two hands tighten on the wicker rim. The river makes its own sound and waits for no one. Yet some small thing in him will not finish the task in the clean, final way he was told. Perhaps it is the flood itself that changes him. Perhaps it is the strange that babies sleep through plans made against them. Perhaps the night has become too large for palace orders. Whatever the reason, he does not cast the basket into the main pool of the water. He moves instead along the drowned edge. He searches with his feet. He looks for some place less fierce. Fate often enters old stories with thunder and bright signs. Here it arrives more quietly. It comes as a servant edging sideways in the dark, trying to find a spot that does not feel like murder. And then there is that fig tree. It waits at the foot of the Palatine Hill, with roots spread out like old hands in the wet earth. The flood has climbed around it too. Water presses in and circles past. Yet between those roots there is a little pause in the current. It is not dry land exactly. It is more like a brief thought of land. The servant sees it. He lowers the basket there. He does not send it spinning out into the river's center. He leaves it wedged against the roots, where the water can lift it, rock it, and not quite take it away. The wicker settles with a faint scrape. The blanket inside stays tucked. The basket moves once, then rests. It is a small image. It stays in the mind with surprising force. Two children meant to vanish are caught instead by a tree on a hillside that will one day become unbearably famous. At this hour it is only a hill. It is only roots and floodwater. It is only one of those quiet places where history puts down a marker before anyone knows to call for a witness. The servant stands there for a moment longer. He does not make a speech. He does not ask the gods for a receipt. He looks and turns away. Even this old tale, with all its later glory, allows one plain human pause. The night inside the palace has its own stillness. Rhea Silvia remains imprisoned there. Her punishment for the broken vow has put her behind stone, behind doors, behind the sort of watchfulness that courts mistake for order. The chamber is dark. The straw is clean enough, which in old stories counts as a luxury. Somewhere outside, a lamp gutters in a passage. Somewhere farther off, a guard clears his throat and shifts his feet. She says nothing. Her silence fills the room more fully than words could have done. It is not the silence of agreement. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence left when there is nothing useful to tell people who have already decided everything. In another chamber, the chronicler sits near a fire that has burned down to a red bed of coals. Wax tablets lie on the knee. Stylus meets surface in small, patient strokes. The city beyond the court is dim now. The crater lake above Alba Longa is dark glass under the stars. The scent of worn stone lingers in the halls. Burnt grain offerings still hang faintly in the air, as if the day has not quite finished leaving. A record must be made, even when the record cannot say all it knows. So the hand writes the safe part first. The twins were last seen on the river. Then the hand pauses. It listens to the night. It thinks of the flood, the swallowed banks, the basket against the fig roots, and the great width of dark water beyond them. Then it adds, with all the truth that caution will allow, that the river is very wide. After that, the stylus is set down. The fire gives one small sigh. Outside, the Tiber goes on moving, as rivers do, carrying rumor, silt, moonlight, and unfinished plans toward the plain. Now the hills are quiet again, and the whole story seems to rest inside that quiet, like warmth inside folded wool. The night has weight. The fire has grown small, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, the dark river keeps its patient way through the reeds. At last, even Amulius's slightly crooked gold laurel wreath sits still in the empty chamber, as if worry itself has finally grown too tired to fidget. May your dreams be free of prophecies that name your bloodline specifically. May your dreams contain no divine visitors, arriving unannounced in sacred groves. May your Tiber always flay gently, and may any basket you own stay firmly on dry land. Thank you for listening. May the mind rest easy, and good night.